Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming along. I've been ski touring for about 25 years now. I was originally a climber, and then I kind of got into ski touring and started out telemarking, and then converted to alpine after a few years, and kind of realised it was easier and faster and stuff. Yeah, and then in the early 2000s. I led a few trips to the Eagle Ski Club, some in Turkey, some in the area that I'm going to talk about tonight. I guess the first question is, what is the Balkans, or where is the Balkans? And it's actually not very specifically defined. So the Balkan Peninsula is the whole bit of land between the Aegean and the Black Sea on the one side and the Adriatic on the other. So that includes all of the countries that used to be in Yugoslavia, plus Bulgaria, some say parts of the southern part of Romania, and also Greece. But generally, I think when people talk about the Balkans, they exclude Greece generally. And to me, it's the area of kind of mountainous terrain that stretches down from the southern end of Slovenia down to kind of near the Greek border and going across into Bulgaria. That's kind of, I think, what most people think of in terms of the Balkans when they're thinking of the kind of region and the mountains. So that's a kind of rough outline of the area they're talking about. As you can see, and everybody I think is familiar, it's a generally mountainous area. So most of that peninsula is mountainous, and that varies between ranges which are in the kind of 1,000 meter to 1,500 to 2,000 range. A lot of the area is covered with that kind of terrain. And then there are higher parts, massifs that stick out of that. But the main ranges that we've got here, there are the actual Balkan Mountains themselves are, and just tell me if you can see the mouse, this range up in the northeast corner in northern Bulgaria. So from Serbia into northern Bulgaria. But actually that's a relatively uninteresting range in terms of ski touring potential compared with some of the other areas. So as I say, the other main ranges are the Dynaric Mountains, which stretch right through Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and into Albania, and bordering with Kosovo and Macedonia. And then there's also the Pindus Mountains in Greece, but I'm going to exclude that from this, because as I say, most people tend to think of Greece as outside the Balkans. So it's going to be the area north of that. So looking at that area, one of the first things I often do when I'm trying to figure out good new places to go ski touring is have a look at the climate there. And I really want to get an idea of what the snowpack is going to be like. And the first part of that, there's two parts really. You need to look at obviously the temperature in winter and also the precipitation in winter. And this is an annual precipitation map, but it still gives you a reasonably good idea of the winter precipitation as well. And you can see that it's very much dominated by the western side of the peninsula up against the Adriatic. And from that, you can figure out fairly easily that it's those ranges along the Dynaric Alps which are really going to be the ones that have the best snowpack. There's enough in the Bulgarian ranges to have a kind of decent winter snowpack as well. But in terms of the volume of snow, there's more in the high ranges near the Adriatic, which is one of the reasons that's the main area we'll be talking about today. This is just an overview of, and we'll come back to this later, but this is an overview of the areas that I think are of most interest for ski touring in the Balkans. And as you can see, there's a lot. I've kind of color coded them so that they're of decreasing interest or kind of scope in terms of how much there is there and how good it is. So red is the kind of prime stuff, orange is worthwhile, and yellow are kind of smaller areas that are worth a day or two and of interest, but not kind of key areas. And you can see from that there's Prokletije is the one that stands out above all the others. It's bigger, and also the terrain is really spectacular, and it gets the best snowpack in the whole of the area as well. Excuse me. So unsurprisingly, that's where I've spent my skiing time in this part of the world. So one thing I should point out, I'm talking about 3 ski trips to Prokletije, which is the same, just one area of mountains, which spans the border of Montenegro, Albania, and Kosovo. And I'll be talking a little bit about potential in those other areas as well. And I've been to quite a few of them mountain biking, but I've not skied in any of them. So it will be a kind of overview of what I think the potential looks like there, with some photos of them in winter. But it'll be interesting to hear what John has to say about the Shah Mountains as well later. So this is a Google Earth view of Prokletije, which is the area. It's the main. It's often called the Dynaric Alps or the Albanian Alps. The majority of it is in Albania, but there's also parts in Montenegro and Kosovo. And I call it Prokletije because it's easier than the Albanian name. The Albanian name is Bishke Inamuna, which means the Accursed Mountains, interestingly. And there's different accounts of why that is. So I think the modern accounts tend to say that it's because the terrain is very difficult, whereas the slightly less politically correct older accounts tend to suggest it's because there's a history of blood feuds in this region. So it was a very kind of unstable and quite violent area in the 19th and early 20th century, and that I think is not an issue these days, but it had a long history of being quite wild and dangerous. So that's one theory of why it's called the Accursed Mountains. So, as I say, I'll be talking about three trips there. The first one of which was an Eagle Ski Club trip in 2007, and it's the first time I've been there. And the reason I wanted to come here was actually on the flight back from a ski trip in Turkey. I saw these mountains out of the window of the plane, and I had no idea what they were, but they looked amazing. They were very, very steep, kind of proper pointy mountains, and I thought, wow, that looks phenomenal. I'm going to have to figure out what that place is and hopefully try and get there. And I managed to do that the next year. I'd never heard of the area before. I didn't know anything about it at all. And I think that's a kind of feature of Albania in general, because it was closed for such a long time. And even after it opened in the early 90s, it had a pretty nasty few years in the 90s and was really still off the map until early in the 2000s. And because of that, people don't know very much about it still. It's still very much on the kind of, the quiet end of tourism in that part of the world. But actually, it's got the best mountains, and it's a phenomenal place to go to in terms of culture, but also the skiing experience as well is amazing. On this first trip, though, we actually accessed the range from the Montenegro side, and the reason for that is partly because it's easier to get there. And it's easier to stay in some of there's a village, this village Gusini, which is at the foot of the mountains here, is relatively kind of easy to get to, and it's easy to find accommodation and that kind of thing. So we started here, and there are two main valleys that come in from Montenegro. So the one marked here with the hut is called Gurbaya, and the one here with the blue line is Ropiana. And both of these valleys are amazingly spectacular, really, really beautiful, very steep mountains. And actually they both lead into Albania. So a lot of the skiing that you can do from them ends up being on the Albanian side of the border. But you can get agreement from the local police in Montenegro, and if you go and kind of see them, they will register that you're crossing the border, and you can do that, and it's okay to do that. Okay, so this is the team for the 2007 trip. So we have Derek Buckle, Will Tapsfield, Davey Frame, Dave Smith, Richard Anthony, and Richard Cooper. So it was quite a big trip, and actually it was great. It was really, really good fun trip. One of the nice things about coming in from Montenegro as well is that you fly to Dubrovnik. So we had a half day in Dubrovnik to look around at the beginning, which is fantastic. This I love, Punk's Not Dead, and two of the kind of old timers from the trip proving it. And then this is the same two not surprisingly, skinny dipping in the harbour in Dubrovnik, which is quite an experience. I'm glad that I took the photo then and not later. So the drive from Dubrovnik is about 6 hours to Gosinje. It's quite an involved route. You've got to cross this ferry at the Kotor Fjord, which is about an hour in, and then you've got a long drive up through, right up into the north of Montenegro, and then back down south to the border. When we arrived in Gosinje, then the first thing, I'd done some research and found somebody who was the president of the local mountaineering club, who's this guy whose name I'm afraid I've forgotten, in the red top. And to find him, we went to the police station, and this is us in the police station with him poring over some maps and talking about routes that we can do. I haven't been in touch with him since that trip, so I'm not sure if he's still around or helping out, but that was quite useful. But this is a good thing to do in general, is to register with the police when you get there and tell them what you're doing. So the first day we went to the hut in Grabaya, and this is inside there. It's a lovely spot, but there's no electric light, which is kind of slightly weird, but it's fantastic. It's got this big, it's kind of from the Soviet era where they used to do a lot of mountaineering. So the Montenegrin part is well explored, and there are a lot of old mountaineering routes documented, but nothing on the Albanian side before the 90s. So this is the hut, and we made an absolute tip of the hut with our gear, and this is heading off on the first morning, and we don't really know much about what's there. So it was the early days of Google Earth. The quality was less good than it is now, and it's still actually very poor in this area because of the nature of the terrain. And we really didn't have much in the way of mapping. So we're heading out behind the hut and seeing what we find, really. There's a steep, the snow line was quite high this year, so a steep walk up through this dense woodland until we hit the snow line. And this is where we're going. So we're going up into this bowl and seeing what we find up there. And it starts to open out, getting close to the tree line. But then the weather turned. We got up to a summit at about 1,800 meters and decided to call it a day there and headed back down. And then the following day, we were planning to spend a bit of time at the hut, and then the idea was to go into the other valley and set up a base camp there. And this morning we woke up, the weather looked a bit ropey, it snowed a bit in the night, and we thought we would cut our losses and shift to the other place and use the bad weather day to actually ski up to our base camp. So as you can see here, it's a fairly long approach from the roadhead down in this village of Vaganiza. I think it's about, I don't know, it's about 10 or 12k, something like that. And it's not a huge height gain, but there was quite a lot of walking that day with a heavy pack. So it's about a 4-hour approach, something like that. But actually, it's really spectacular. As you get further up into the valley, there's some amazing big rock walls, really spectacular peaks to look at as you walk up this valley. And again, the climbing potential here, I'm sure, is really interesting, and very, very little's been done at all. And in fact, we'll have a look at some of them later, but some peaks are potentially haven't been climbed yet at all. And again, it's partly because of the terrain. It's very complex, and the stuff that is visible and was explored from the Montenegro side tends to have been done, but some of the stuff above the Ropiana Valley that's not visible from Montenegro, I don't think has really been explored at all. And I'll point out where that is later. So we're just getting to the snow line. One of the features of this part of the world is there's quite a lot of dense forest low down, and there are not many paths, and the ones that there are tend to kind of peter out in the middle of nowhere. So there's often quite a lot of bushwhacking, which we'll see plenty of on this trip, all the other ones actually particularly. And this is just arriving at the place where we're going to set up our base camp, just in this basin down here. As you can see, there's some really beautiful peaks up there, and they're a really nice mix. There's some very steep ones that are kind of challenging climbs in their own right, but there's also peaks that are really good for skiing. There's a really nice balance between the two. So it's very spectacular terrain, but there's a lot to do from a skiing point of view. So the plan here was to set up a base camp. This is about 1,500 meters, and we had food for about 4 days, I think, 4 or 5 days. And so this is where we set up camp. And then the following day, heading out to, again, just explore. And we don't know what we're going to find at all. The maps are really pretty worthless at this point. So we're just heading up and trying to see what we can see and figure out some good stuff to ski. So we're going to head up to the end of the valley here and then see what appears up there. And as we start moving, we can see that the cloud is thinning, and actually it looks like we might get a decent day. This is another feature of skiing, and well, anything in Albania, is there are apparently 2 million of these pillboxes around the country, generally near the borders, and this one's right on the border. And these were set up in the communist era. It was very, very kind of paranoid, isolated state, and it was quite kind of militarized. And they have these pillboxes absolutely everywhere, which are kind of interesting. So this is just a view of the first day out we did. So skiing up here, the border's here, and there's actually the ruins of an old barracks here as well on the Albanian side. And we just headed up here into a kind of minor peak. One thing to say about this is, because of the terrain, which is very steep and also there's a lot of depressions, and it's a cast limestone landscape. So it's very complex terrain. There's lots of kind of holes and sharp peaks, steep walls, spiky mountains, and Google Earth deals with that very poorly. So a lot of it looks very flattened, and there are places where there are huge peaks that just don't appear at all on the 3D model. So it's kind of really important to be aware of that when you're planning things, because it's a lot steeper than it looks generally. So as we head up, the weather is still kind of promising to improve, but hasn't got there yet. But as we get higher up, it really starts to clear out, and we start getting a proper view. This is looking back towards the south, over some of the Albanian peaks. This is an area we're going to explore later. We actually climb this peak later on. And again, as we get higher up, you can see now that even though the snow line was only around 1,400 meters, by the time you're here, which is just over 2,000, it's a really good deep snowpack. So it increases massively over a relatively short altitude range. And now we're getting a bit higher. This is the highest peak in the background, Maja Zerza. And this is looking down into a valley in Albania called the Tethy Valley, which is very low. And it has a village in it, which is, I'm not sure this is still correct, but until very recently at least, it was cut off for 7 months of the year by, there was only one road to it over a high pass, and that was cut off throughout the winter. So it's a very, very interesting place, really kind of remote and isolated place. And then we just took the skis off to just climb up this little peak and really have a look around. This is Dave on the summit of that peak, and now we've got a really good panoramic view into Albania and other things that we might be able to do. And this area kind of took our interest, and we're going to come and explore that when we get a chance. And this is just skiing back down more or less the same way. It's very kind of firm snow. You can see there's no tracks here at all. It was so kind of frozen. That's another thing to mention, actually. It's very close to the Adriatic, so it's a maritime snowpack, which is really good from the point of view of avalanche issues. So it's obviously there are issues, but it's massively helped by the fact that it's a moist environment, and there's a constant kind of interplay in the weather between continental air and maritime air, which means that you get a lot of freeze thaw there, which stabilizes snowpack very helpfully. And at this point, it was generally just frozen rock hard. As you can see, the same lower down. And then this is back at base camp. These are some of the peaks above the Ropiana Valley, and as far as I know, these two, these are not named on any map. There's no spot heights. This peak on the left was first climbed in 2009, but I've not come across a record of either of these being climbed at all. And the reason is they're not apparent. It's not apparently obvious that they're separate from this one behind until you actually get very close to them. So there's definitely some exploring to do there, and some amazing rock walls around the back of this. This is Richard. I don't recommend this, but juggling ice axes, which is a kind of nice thing to do at base camp. We had a bad weather day, and 3 of us went just to explore this gully up here and see what we could find. And actually, we didn't find much. We disappeared into the mist. It got very steep. We got fairly high, but couldn't see what was up there, and bailed out at some point. And then we went and gathered a load of wood for a big campfire, which was very nice. Then the following day, we headed out to try and explore that area that we'd seen on the first day. This was interesting. So Prokletija is the only area in Europe that's still got lynxes, apparently, and also has bears and wolves. So it's very unlikely you're going to see them, I think, but kind of interesting, and it tells you something about how remote and wild it still is as well, particularly on the Albanian side. So we're heading up towards, this is a peak called Arapa, which you'll see later, up into that bowl. And here we are, just kind of emerging into that bowl. And we're going to head up here and see what we can find. And actually this peak up here is one of the ones that we ended up skiing. It looks slightly unpromising from this side, but around the back it turned out to be okay. This is a picture that kind of shows you something about the terrain. Again, the cast and the way that there are lots of hollows and depressions in the terrain. So it can be quite complex picking a line through this stuff. You don't want to go into the hole and have to climb out again. But again, traversing round is not always straightforward as well. So you've got to be quite kind of canny on navigation in these bowls. This is the peak of Arapa again, and it's a major thing in Albanian mountaineering. The other side of it has about an 800-meter limestone wall, which has had some kind of big roots put up on it recently. So this is getting further into the bowl, and at this point, or soon after this, we actually split into 2 groups. So 3 of the team decided they really wanted to ski this slope, which does look fantastic, and headed off over that way to these peaks over here in this slope. And actually they climbed this peak here, and then traversed across and skied this. And the other 3 of us, I should say actually at this point, Richard Cooper had to leave us after a couple of days. He'd broken his finger before he came on the trip, and turned out that it actually couldn't really ski with it, so he'd left us. So we're now down to 6, and the other 3 of us headed up here to see what we could find, and ended up skiing round onto that peak we saw before. This is a map of that area. So as you can see, we went past where we'd been the other day up here, past that kind of amazing thumb-shaped peak, and then we split here, and 3 of us did this little circuit here, and 3 of us did this peak up here, which is just under 2.5, and was actually an amazing little route. It looked very unlikely that we could get up this peak. It's got a lot of kind of quite big rock faces on it, and actually there's a route that kind of winds its way up, and then you can get right up to the top, which is really, really stunning. This is the other guys climbing their little peak. So that's Derek, and it was Dave and Richard climbed that peak. This is looking down as the Albanian side again, and Dave on the summit. And this is looking from our peak down to the one that they're on, which was here. And actually they climbed a peak just either this one or just out to the right, traversed across here, and then skied down this slope here, which does look great. So this is the peak that the rest of us did, and it does have a name. I think it's called Reskulit. Again, it's very hard to find names for a lot of the peaks here, or spot heights or anything. There's not a lot of documentation, but that's what I think it's called. So the next day, weather wasn't fantastic, and we decided to head up again. most days we're going up through this same Cowell, across the border, and then this day we decided to explore this little peak on the left-hand side. It wasn't great weather, and we got to here and then skis off and just climbed this little section up here. And this again is looking out into Albania. And that was it. So that was our 4 days at base camp, and we it felt like we'd done some good stuff. We got to a reasonably high peak, explored a bit and got a feel for the area, but there was very much unfinished business there. So I was very keen to get back. But this is now heading back out again, out the Ropiana Valley, and a few beers and meeting up with our friend from the climbing club again. And then we went back to the Gabaya Valley and stayed in the hut again. And this is just a view of that valley. You can see it's really, really beautiful, spectacular terrain. And so we had a day and a half really here. Again, we split. So three did a tour up into this bowl up here, and eventually found a Cowell up here, behind here, and 3 of us decided to try and climb Carenfield. So we didn't take skis at all because it was very steep, but this peak here, and actually the summit is behind along a little ridge, but we'll see that. So these are the 2 routes. So Carenfield is a really spectacular peak, which we'll see later on from elsewhere. And this was the route up to the Cowell. And just again, this is a bit of bushwhacking. This is the other guys heading up to the Cowell, which is up here. And they come up to this window here. But as you can see, it's really spectacular terrain. This is looking down into the Ropiana Valley on the other side of that Cowell. And then 3 of us, so me and Derek and Will, heading up to Carenfield. This is on the way up, and some kind of spectacular rock stuff. This is now, we actually crossed the Cowell, and this is coming up the last, it's quite a steep face up to the summit. And this is skiable for a good skier, but it's pretty steep. It's about 45 degrees. And this is looking down on the other side. You can see some really spectacular mountains, very steep and pointy. That's Maya Zerza, which is the highest peak in the background. And this is Will just arriving on the summit. And again, you can see the nature of the terrain behind. Looking down here, this is the Cowell that we've been crossing. Our base camp is down here, and this is where we were going over and then exploring the terrain out to the left and right behind here, which we'll see in the next trip. And then once we're on the summit ridge, this is actually the highest point. So we traverse this ridge over to there. And this is me standing on the top. And then this is looking over to a peak called Popadilla, which is actually what we're going to do the next day, and looking into Montenegro. And this is some of the other peaks in Montenegro in the background. So back in the hut on our last night there. And then this is going up to the peak that we just mentioned, Popadilla, up at the top of this little valley that we'd explored on the first day. And this is it's quite a small peak, but it's really amazing views from there. This is on the way up, and this is the Carenfield peaks in the background. So this is the peak that we climbed on the back. You go through this Cowell, around the back and up the back of this peak, and then that was the ridge line that we traversed to here. But as you can see, it's really spectacular terrain. And this is actually a kind of panorama from the top. You can see most of this, so the border is around here. So most of this is actually in Albania, but these peaks here, Carenfield is in Montenegro. But as you can see here, most of this is completely unexplored from the skiing point of view. And some of these peaks here, these 2 here are the ones that I can't find any record of having been climbed. Just the summit group photo. And then we had a fantastic ski down. It was just perfect spring snow. So skiing right off the summit and down quite steep at the top, but then there's fantastic spring snow and just huge GS turns down there. And then this is back down at the valley, and spring is really sprung now. Really beautiful. The whole valley was carpeted in these crocuses, so it's really, really lovely. And that's our final drinks with some of our friends, the locals. And I think that's the end of that trip. Oh yeah, and just final dinner. We met up with Richard again, and this is our kind of final night dinner in Dubrovnik, which is great. So that brings us to 2010. So there was, as I said, there was a lot of stuff that I still wanted to do from that, and I wanted to do another Eagle trip there. So in 2010, I organised a second trip there, and this was the team for that one. So Misha Gopal, who was my business partner in FATMAP, or became my business partner in FATMAP, Asta Cairns, and these are the Handley brothers, so Sam and Chris Handley. This is the new hotel in Gosini, which we found. There hadn't been much when we were there the time before, but it was kind of developing. We stayed in this hotel. And this year the snow line was low, there's snow in town. This is just a shot of the dodgiest bar that I've ever been in my life. Was in the first floor of this building over here. And we had one night in there, and there's some stories to tell about that, but I won't tell them now. But it was very interesting. So the plan was kind of similar to the last time, but we want to explore the same areas but new stuff. So this is back in Grabaya, and we had a kind of afternoon, so we headed up. I think this is in the same valley as that we looked at last time, but just getting up above the tree line and having a kind of first kind of group ski to get everyone's legs and see how we're doing, and then back in the hut without the lights at night, which was really lovely. And then the next day we decided to head up to Popadia again, because that's really beautiful and it gives us a chance to look at the terrain, and really I wanted to kind of get a feel for the group. But this is different this year, so there's lots of snow, and it's a bit of fresh snow in the woods as well. So it's really lovely skiing up through there. And this time we're going to follow the ridge around to the summit instead. And this is the ridge. So we're coming out of the trees now. We're going to follow this kind of corniced ridge up there. And it was a nice day. There's some really stunning views on this day. The clouds are kind of in and out, but bits of sunlight on the mountains, and it was just absolutely spectacular. Again, this is looking over to this is not Canfillies on the left, but this is some of the peaks higher up the valley, at the head of that valley. Really, really beautiful. So this is the ridge that we're following up to the peak. And yeah, again, just really beautiful light, and just a spectacular day. And not a huge day, and not a kind of massive summit, but it's really worth doing just because the views are amazing. And then again, we skied down the same way. This is down at the hut, and this is the view from the hut, which is really stunning. Got a bit of alpenglow, and this doesn't really come out, but the first time we'd seen from the valley really clear conditions was actually at night, and you can kind of get a sense of just how spectacular it is. So the next day, we decided to go up and explore the head of the valley, which we hadn't really done yet. At the end of the 2007 trip, they'd explored the left branch of it, but the right branch goes further, and we wanted to have a look up there. So we're heading up here. Steep terrain, kind of mixed. There's lots of avalanche debris, quite thick trees, and there's a lot of this in kind of exploring in Albania. There's not many tracks. So there's not always routes cut through the trees. It's quite steep, and you'll see more of this later, but that is a feature. You need to be prepared to kind of fight your way through some kind of fairly dense stuff and some steep terrain. And then coming out into the kind of alpine zone, and we're just following our nose really here, looking for a summit to ski. The weather's kind of slightly marginal. It starts to get quite windy, and actually, so we head up here, keep going up this bowl, and eventually we find a peak up here. Again, it's completely flattened on Google Earth. There's a decent peak here, which is a really nice ski peak. It's just over 2.4, and really recommend as a day trip if anyone goes there. And this is just coming up to the summit. I think this is the Handley brothers. I think they took their skis off. which is quite brave with no crampons, and on the summit here. And then back in the hut for another night there. So the day after we'd done what we wanted to do for the moment in Gubaya, so we are now heading again up into the Ropiana Valley as we did, and basically it's the same base camp that we had the previous trip, but this time it's all under snow, which is much nicer, so we can actually ski up there. The day, it was actually a horrible ski up. It was raining most of the way, and the following day was horrible as well. This is me playing chess with Chris, and it was kind of sleeting most of the day. It started turning snow later on, but we weren't going to go anywhere because the weather was just horrible. But Sam decided he was going to build an igloo, so he started off on his own, and then we gradually joined him, and he's making progress, and this is the final capping stone going on, and that's inside. It was absolutely amazing igloo. We could fit all 5 of us in there very comfortably, and we used it for the rest of the time we were there. It was brilliant as a kind of like a sort of mess tent, but an igloo. It was really good. Great piece of engineering by Sam. So the following morning, we got up and it's snowed in the night, so the rain turned to snow, which is great, and it's looking like we've got that same thing of some low cloud in the valley, but actually it's clearing up above, and really, really spectacular views of these peaks under fresh snow. So we decided that we would go and try and ski the highest peak. So Maja Zerza, this is the thing that I really wanted to do from this base camp. It's quite a long day, but the weather looked good in the morning, so we decided to give it a go. And skiing up to the border again. This is the peak of Arapa again, and we just kind of crossed the border now. We're contouring around to the left here to get round into another bowl. It's quite a long way around. It takes you into this bowl though, and then we actually wanted to try and ski 2 peaks. So Popluks, which is one of the other high peaks, and Maja Zerza up here. These again are the peaks on above the Ropiana Valley. It's these 2 that are the possibly unclimbed ones, and again you can see they're really, really spectacular. And this is the final climb onto the summit of Popluks, which is actually, it's fairly steep from some angles, but actually the ski up goes around the back and it's very gentle. It's a really nice ski. This is looking down now into the Valbona Valley, which is the main valley on the Albania side, which we'll come to later. And all of us, and this is the peaks on the other side of that valley, which is another whole range really, another massive, which we'll see later. This is just coming up to the summit. And this is the view over to Maja Zerza, which is the highest peak. And it looks kind of deceptively, it looks kind of fairly gentle and flat, and actually it's not. From other eyes, it's much narrower than it looks, and actually this side here is actually quite steep. But it's, if you're a really good skier, you can ski from the summit, but it's pretty full on, and the climb up there is not kind of negligible either. So by this point, the Handley brothers decided they didn't want to do Zerza, so they'd skied off. And then Alistair came up to here, which is the bottom of this, the kind of steep section really, and decided that he was going to call it a day there. And just Misha and me carried on to the summit, which is on this you climb up kind of behind this bit of the ridge here, and then there's a bit of narrow ridge to the summit. But it's really, it's not a difficult peak, and it's really well worthwhile. The next day, the weather wasn't great, so we decided to try and explore this is the western side of Ropiana, and we hadn't really had a look here. We'd been over the border, which is somewhere here, somewhere over here, over this col anyway, and explored beyond here, but we've not looked up here yet, so decided to do that. But actually the weather was pretty ropey. We made it out to a high col, but we couldn't see anything by the time we got there, so ski back down. And that evening the weather was definitely turning, it started snowing. And then, so it snowed quite a lot in the night and carry on the next day. So this is our last day there. So we decided to just spend a couple of hours doing some skiing in the deep snow, which was fun, but really hard work as well. It was good, sort of 40 centimeters of fresh snow. So we did a couple of hours of that, and then, oh, this is just standing on the roof of the igloo. So by this time it's really properly set hard, and yeah, it's a good igloo. So this is skiing out of from the Ropiana base camp. As you can see, it's a completely different story now. It's deep, fresh snow. Again, it's quite bushwhacky and quite challenging skiing through this stuff. But it's much more pleasant than a long walk. Then got back to town, and there's decent amount of snow there as well. So we had another night in the hotel. And then the following day, we were going to drive half of the distance back to the airport, but we thought we could get a kind of most of a day skiing and kind of drive the half day in the evening, or the 3 hours in the evening. So we went out looking for something fairly low, but with some nice fresh powder, and stopped at this little village called Martinovici and set off from there. I love this photo. This is just a guy that we met as we were heading off, and that one made the front cover of the ski club yearbook, so I was very proud of that one. Alistair took that photo, but I just love it. It's the sort of cultural mismatch is brilliant. So we headed up into these woods looking for some powder fields, and there was a path marked on some map, but it very quickly petered out into complete bushwhacking. So frustratingly, we gave up and then drove further north, which is actually the way out, past a place called Plav, some very interesting architecture. And we ended up aiming for a place that we drove up as high as we could get to on a pass that actually crosses over to Kosovo, and found a kind of a peak over there to try and do some powder skiing on, called Vaganiza. This is the border here. And you can see it's very different terrain there. It's much gentler. Still nice skiing if the snow's good, but it's not like Prokletia. It's not the kind of spectacular terrain that we've been in before. This is coming over onto the kind of summit plateau, and you can see Prokletia in the background. But we had some really nice snow, some very nice spaced trees, and some great skiing. And then a little climb back out to get back over a col and back down to the car. So that was it for the Eagle Ski Club trips. And then it was quite a long time before I got back there, and that was in 2019. So in the meantime, I've been to the Albanian Alps and the Albanian side of this area on a mountain bike, and come up to Valbona, and the weather was terrible, but I kind of had a look around and started to think, as you can see, this is the kind of the main set of mountains, 3 blocks really. There's this one here, this one in the middle with the highest peak, and then there's another big block down here. And actually we come in from these valleys in the north, which are good for exploring these 2 blocks, but not for this group here. And actually Valbona cuts right into the middle of the whole lot, and as a single valley base, it's probably the best place to get to the biggest number of peaks from. It's quite low, so it's only, Valbona is about 1,000 meters, but you can drive all the way in there in winter, and there is at least one hotel that's open through the winter, so you can stay there. And so I thought it would be really nice to go and explore from that side. And this is a trip that I did with a friend of mine, Richard Emerson, who's a mate of mine from Bristol, who I got to know, and we've done some skiing together, and just the 2 of us went to do this trip. So it's a bit, it's valley based, so we've got a bit more scope to, we're not carrying stuff, we're not setting up base camp, so we've got a bit of scope to try and do some, you know, they're quite big days from this low valley base, so that seemed to work well. So this is where we stayed. It's called the Hotel Majeka. And it's a great place, very cheap, really nice, decent rooms, good food. There was a heli skiing group there when we arrived, and this is something that I didn't know about until we got there, but it's now, there's a company that does heli skiing here, and I'll just show you a little thing at the end, but it's well worth looking at their website and their videos. You can get some idea of some of the terrain around here as well. But as you can see, it's really steep. There's a lot of variety, but this kind of southern wall of the valley is generally steep terrain, and it's in two bits. There's a steep section midway up under trees, and that's often quite a challenge to get through. You have to carefully find your line through the trees and the steep ground in the trees, and then there's a kind of alpine zone which is a bit more amenable, and then the peaks themselves again are steep. But there's loads to do there. I can't think of anywhere else where from a single base, literally from the door of the hotel, you can ski as many peaks in a day. You've got to be prepared to do a decent amount of descent, but if you are, then you can do an incredible number of peaks from one spot. So this is our first day out, and again, maps have improved a little bit and we've got a bit more info, but it's still very much kind of exploring on the ground when you get there. And we decided to have a look on the south side of the valley and try and get to the kind of crest of the ridge and see what we could find, see if we can get up a peak there. This is fairly typical stuff though. There's a lot of avalanche debris you've got to contend with, and a lot of fairly dense trees. This day we had we're above it now, but there's about 200 or 300 meters of really steep trees in soft snow that was really hard work to get up to this point. So this is where the hotel is, and we are literally going straight up from there, up through, these are nice trees down here, and then this zone here is very steep trees, and we found a gully to get through kind of some rocks at the bottom, and it's just steep. But then here we come up above that into the alpine zone, and we're in this kind of terrain, looking for a way up to the Cowell, which we found. And this is now looking right down into beyond the mountains into Albania, Maine. On the south side, it's a lot gentler, but this valley here is really inaccessible. The road only comes to about 500 meters, and there's some very, very kind of isolated, quite backward settlements up at about 700 or 800 meters, but nothing beyond that at all, and it's really wild in here. So unfortunately it's not a kind of really feasible way to get in unless you're prepared to take a day or two to make the journey. So this is on the ridge, and we're looking at this peak to do, but it's pretty steep, and we decided at that time that we were not going to tackle it that day, but that's one to come back for, and possibly actually easier from the other side, I think. And then this is on the ski down, so a lot of this, some pretty, just a lot of combat skiing really, steep trees, deep snow, really heavy snow as well, and then quite a lot of avalanche debris to contend with as well, but Rich looking very stylish there. And this is the area of trees that we went up through, and I think we're actually out to the right of here. So the next day we decided to do a peak on the other side of the valley called Rosette, which is actually one of the highest peaks. It's on the border with Montenegro. It's one of the highest peaks in Montenegro, and it's more amenable. It's not quite as steep, but again we had a fairly steep climb up through the trees, but not as steep as the other side. This is looking at where we were the day before. This area up here. And we actually came up to this Cowell here. So this is on the north side of the Albania Valley, and this is the peak that we're going for up on the border. And actually it's a great ski peak. Again, you need to do about 1,600 meters of ascent, so it's not horrendous, but it's a fairly big day. But it's okay. A really nice terrain. The snow's not great, but it was all right. This is actually on the ski down, and we skied right off the east face, which is quite nice, steep at the top, and it kind of weaves around. And then we had we're coming down to this Cowell here, and then there's a nice long kind of southwest facing slope down here, so that was quite nice spring snow. and then back down to the hotel. And this is just looking back up at the area where we were the day before, and then we're going to go up here later on. You'll see we go up this bowl up there. So the next day we wanted to try and ski Maja Zrce, again the highest peak, but from this side, which is quite a long trip. So heading out fairly early up the valley, and it's quite a long slog up the valley in a kind of riverbed for a few kilometers, and then you start climbing eventually, and it comes up to the right around here. Trying to follow paths, but that was really hard. They were very hard to follow, and we ended up climbing up this quite steep gully, just because it was kind of clear of trees, and it was the only way we could see clearly through. And then we get up towards the top of the trees, and it starts to open out again. I seem to have come to a point where I'm going to start this again. Let's do that. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yeah, so just coming up towards the top of the tree line here, this is looking down to some other peaks on the south wall of Valbona. Again, there's some really good stuff to do here. Really spectacular, some steep terrain, but also potential to be able to get to some of these peaks and possibly even ski off the summit of them. This is the Tethy Valley over here. And this is the ridge. You can see, yeah, quite a long slog up the valley, and then steep climb up a gully here, and then the trees start thinning out, and then we cross a col here. This is Poplux and Maja Zrce, which we did from the other side, and we pop through the same col here and heading up to Maja Zrce. A lot of snow this year. Really good snowpack high up. And this is coming to a point where we ditch the skis now. We're actually just below the point where you start climbing steeply. And this is looking back at Maja Poplux, which is the other peak that we'd done the year before, a few years ago. And actually this year we had a look at the climb up, and it wasn't in very good condition. So we actually bailed out at about 2,600 and headed back down, which is a shame, but we didn't have any kind of gear really, and thought that was a sensible option. But it'd be nice to go back and do it from that side at some point. So this is a ski down. We stayed on the kind of west facing side to get the best of the spring snow. Had a few nice turns down here, and then lower down there's a lot more of this stuff. So basically quite steep, narrowish gully through the trees with lots of avalanche debris in it, which is unfortunately there's quite a lot of. I think if you got there, we were there in early March. I think if you were there and actually I think we were slightly unlucky with the weather. As I say, it swaps between maritime and continental, but if you happen to get kind of nice fresh snow, I think it'd be fantastic, covering the kind of debris. But if you're at the wrong end of a maritime warm episode, it's not so good. But this is a day out that we took just in the local town, and some macho Albanian sculptures, which are quite interesting. This is a town called Pirin, which is kind of just at the bottom of the Valbona Valley. And then our final day in Valbona, we decided to do another route on the south side of the valley. So this is looking back up to Maja Zrce up here, behind there. And again, working up through the avalanche zone, and then we're starting to get to the alpine zone above the trees. Really beautiful. And we're looking for another way onto the ridge. This is the second highest peak in the area. And we're trying to get to this ridge and see what we see up there. And then you'll see in a bit, there's a little branch off here. So this looks like the easiest way up to the ridge, up this kind of little couloir up here. So we headed up there and got to the top of that, but actually the terrains are really steep all around that, both sides, the ridge on both sides, and also the drop on the other side. So there's not really anything to do from there except ski back down. which is nice. Not amazing snow, but it's still, yeah, just a nice little ski down the cool one. And then this is something, I spotted this cave up here and thought that looks like a fantastic thing to go and have a look at. Rich declined the offer, so I did this one on my own, but he waited around while I boot packed up here and then skied out of it, and it was really cool. This is the view from inside the cave, looking out of that second highest peak, and then this is the view down the cool one, which is quite steep, but it's on the sunny side, so the snow is actually all right. And this is looking back up the caves just under this rock wall here. But that was really fun. And then just heading out and back down to the valley again. This is looking up, as you can see, there's a whole kind of zone mid-height through the steep tree zone where there's lots of avalanche debris. And I think that's probably a kind of pretty standard feature. Okay, so just to finish off, and I'll race through these. At the end of that trip, so we had 5 days in Valbona, and then we also wanted to just explore a little bit into the Kosovan side of the range, which I'd not had a look at before at all. And we picked 2 peaks that we wanted to do. So we drove over, across the border. It's not very far, it's only a couple of hours drive. It's a place called Desan, and we wanted to just scout out the route for the highest peak. But on the way, there's this amazing monastery, which is really worth looking at. It has a UN kind of protection force to look after it because there's still kind of ethnic trouble there. But it's got apparently some of the most extensive kind of medieval murals in any church in the world, and it is absolutely stunning. There's no one there. So we had a kind of couple of hours to scout out this route. As you can see, the terrain's a lot gentler over here. It's part of the same range, but it's very different terrain, really. Still good, and it would be, you can find some really nice stuff to do in good conditions, but it's not as spectacular and it's not as challenging terrain. This is looking up to Jaravica, which is the highest peak in Kosovo, and it's the second highest peak in the range actually, but it's as you can see, it's not quite the same as the Albanian Alps. So after an afternoon scouting the main peak, we had a day and came to ski this peak called Guri Kuk, which is another of the high ones. And this is quite a long climb. This is only just about 1,000 meters, and it's a bit involved as well. There was kind of a bit of trickery finding a route. There's not very good maps, and we ended up in, again, kind of fairly steep, shitty stuff through the avalanche zone. And the peak itself was fine, but it's not anything to write home about. The conditions weren't brilliant either, but it'd be a nice. It'd be a nice area to have a day or two in good conditions, but it's not worth the trip in its own right, I don't think. I didn't feel it was. And then this is the day after coming back to ski Jaravica, which is this one. Slightly nicer day. Come up through this little kind of summer village and climbed up into the kind of loft for a little snack and then rest. And then it's quite a long kind of walk and ski up the valley. It's quite a long approach, and then fairly straightforward up to the peak. There's a little kind of gully you climb up on the way, but nothing too taxing really. And then this is on the summit, and looking over towards the Albanian Alps, we can't really see it under the cloud. And then a kind of reasonable ski down, and I think that's it. So those are the trips that I've done to that area skiing. So very quickly, I just want to run through what I think are the other areas with most potential, and I'm just going to look at these orange ones. So there's a couple in Bulgaria, and the highest peaks in the whole of the Balkans are in Bulgaria. So there's 2 ranges with both got peaks over 2,900 meters. So the first is Rila, which is the northernmost, so it's just south of the capital sphere. This is where the highest peak is. There's a ski resort just here called Borovets, which is one of the there's two main ones in Bulgaria that Brits sometimes go to. Borovets is one of them. And I'd say I've been mountain biking here in the summer. It's really nice. It's not a huge area, but it's got enough terrain. If you kind of picked your objectives, there's plenty to do there for a week probably. But you might have to, the places that you'd be able to get to in winter with a car leave you quite a long way to go to get to summits, unless you start from the ski area. So you may want to ski in for half a day and put a base camp somewhere if you're going to kind of explore an area. And I think I've got a picture or two of the terrain. These are just stolen from the internet. This is the kind of terrain there. So it's quite, it's reasonably extensive. It's a reasonable snowpack, not as much as further west, and definitely worth, definitely worth an exploration. But again, it's not as dramatic as Procletier. So the next area is Pirin, which is the other main range in Bulgaria. This is very small, but it's got some really spectacular peaks. Again, just over 2,900. The other main ski area in Bulgaria is Banska, which is here. So you can actually get to the highest ones off the lifts in a kind of decent day's touring. But most of the rest of it is actually quite remote, and definitely more than a sensible day from any of the valley bases. So you would need to ski in and put a base somewhere to explore these areas, or kind of the northern end here as well, possibly. But the terrain's more spectacular here, and some really good peaks. This used to be, I remember finding a website on the Bulgarian Extreme Skiing Club, which mostly operated in this area, and looked like they did some quite interesting stuff. That's Pirin. So this area is another area called Sar or Shah, which I think John Eames is going to talk about later. Apparently he's doing a trip there this year for the Eagles. And actually, I've separated it into Sar and Korab, but actually they're kind of connected, but I'll show you why I've separated them in a minute. This is the kind of main part of the range. It's on the border between, this is Kosovo up here and North Macedonia down here. And this is Albania over to the west, so the triple point is here. And most of it follows the border between Kosovo and North Macedonia. And actually the highest peak is inside North Macedonia, but quite a lot of the main watershed is really along the border. And this is a decent area. There's a ski resort here called Popova Shapka, which gives you access to the area around the highest peak. Most of the rest of it, there's also a ski area on the north side called, I think it's called Brezovica, in Kosovo, and you can get access to some of the terrain from there as well. Most of it, though, you could probably drive to close enough to do day tours for exploring most of the rest of it. And I think it's the kind of, this valley's quite low, but I think you'd be able to get high enough to be able to do decent stuff as day tours. But I'm sure John will fill us in on that. This is just a couple of pictures I got from the internet of the kind of terrain. So again, it's less spectacular than Procletier, but it's decent terrain. There's a good snowpack here. And there's kind of fairly well established. There's the ski resorts, and people do touring here. This guy's very pleased we've got to the summit. So the other area, which is Shah, which we just looked at, is up here. This is a kind of connected area called Korab. This is very, very kind of small area, massive, around what's actually the highest peak in the whole of the Shah area, called Korab, which is also is the highest peak in both Albania and North Macedonia. So I've been here in the summer as well on a mountain bike, and actually walked up Korab. And this is really good terrain. This is a picture of someone else ski touring here. And this is, I think, from Korab or near it. But yeah, it's a very small area, but there's some really good terrain there. I think and you can actually approach from either side. I think North Macedonia is more it's more accessible. It's a very long drive to get to the mountains on the Albanian side, but there's definitely a good 3 or 4 days worth of exploring to do in this area if you're kind of looking for somewhere different or tacking it onto a trip somewhere else. And then the final area I just wanted to touch on briefly is in Montenegro. It's called Durmitor, and it's a bit of a spiritual home of the Montenegrins, really. It's not actually the highest peak in Montenegro because that's in Prokletio, but it's very nearly, and it's a very small area. You can see from here, it's tiny, but it's quite spectacular, and it's really beautiful. Again, I've been there in the summer on a mountain bike and had a look around, and it's definitely got a few days of good ski touring to do there. The base is quite high, so you don't need to climb that far to get to summits, so you can potentially do more than one in a day, and there's some steep skiing if you want it. Gets a decent snowpack, so definitely worth exploring as well. And then finally, it's worth kind of mentioning about the area in general. As I said, most of the whole of the peninsula really is mountainous, but the ranges that stick out of that, the massifs that stick out of that, there's lots of them, and they're all good for a day or two of touring. We've looked at the ones that have got more than that, but there are all of these other ones in yellow have got worthwhile terrain to go and ski, and you could, very happily tack together multiple trips to these different areas, and it'd be a kind of really good fun adventure to do that, I think. This is just one example. This is an area, I can't even remember the name, but this is in Albania near the Greek border, and again, just a peak of about 2,400 meters, small massif on its own, but really interesting terrain. And then finally, this is I mentioned there's a heli skiing operation now in Valbona, and this is a still from one of the videos, which is really worth looking up. It's one of the most outrageous lines I've ever seen on a video. If you just Google skiing the Balkans Valley or something like that, you'll find it very easily, but really worth having a look at. And it actually gives you get quite a lot of shots from the helicopter, so it gives you a really good idea of what the terrain's like, and particularly what it's like when there's a nice pound of snow there. Any questions?
Any issues with crossing borders while skiing in the region?
So we haven't had any. We've only done it from the Montenegro side, and that is so because so my Izerts is very often climbed from Montenegro. So there's a police station in the village of called Vršanje, which is the last village before the border. And what we've done on both trips is just go and register at the police station and tell them what you're doing, and they will just kind of sign it off, and that's fine. The whole area is actually covered by something called the Balkans Peace Park, which is set up to try and kind of promote peace and stability in the area. But it's also, I think it helps with getting permission to do crossings of the border. But I haven't done it from the Albanian side. I know that you can. There's a process that you can go through to do it, and actually a lot of the local tour companies say that they will handle that for you if you want to cross the borders. But I've never actually done that by getting the official paperwork. It's been all right to do it from the Montenegro side. So if you're going to do something more complicated and you want to kind of actually cross and go down to civilization on the other side, you definitely need to register. But you can find stuff online that will help you to do that, and people that will do the service for you as well if you need to.
Right, there's a question here from Holly. In your second trip, where was your base camp? They missed it.
So it was in exactly the same place as the first one. So it's the head of the Ropiana Valley, which comes in from Montenegro and goes into Albania. And that's a really good base, actually. You can get to a lot of stuff from a single base, but it's about, you basically waste the day on the way in and the way out. It's only about 3 or 4 hours approach and out, but it takes a day really to do that. So it's a bit of a time cost, but it gets you to a great base, and it's very, it's beautiful. It's very remote feeling. Yeah, if you like that stuff, then that's well worthwhile.
A question for me. You talked earlier about identifying mountains which had or hadn't been climbed and not being able to find a record of 2 of them.
Yeah.
Where are you getting the records from?
I'm just searching on the internet at the moment. I haven't gone beyond that, but there's bits and pieces. I can't remember where I found the info about the 2009 ascent. But yeah, it's really hard to find. Maps are still really bad. There's a trekking map that you can buy of the area, which looks good, but actually you realize when you look at the steep terrain, the contours of steep terrain, it's just nonsense. As is Google Earth, and FATMAP is as well, I'm afraid. It's just, I think the nature of the terrain is very hard for the elevation models to deal with. It's so kind of, yeah, I mean, you can see it perfectly in this background picture of mine. It's very kind of rough and jagged. And that's very hard to map well.
And a question from Anna: any possibility of a traverse in the Albanian Alps, or is it not really the terrain for that?
Yeah, you certainly could do. The only, I guess the only issue with it, you could certainly do that. I think there's a couple of things. One is the valleys are quite low, and so they may not have snow in them, and also it's not really a traverse following the valleys and the low cols. You're not really getting into the best of the terrain. So you could try and thread a traverse through the high terrain, but you've then got the challenge that you've got some steep terrain and you're going to have a big pack. If you want to, I mean, you could do something where you kind of thread a route from valley from one side to the other and have, a day or two to do a crossing and then come back and then go. You could do a kind of a few hops between the valleys. That could possibly work, but I don't think it's ideal as a journey destination. The terrain is kind of steep. So I think it's better for me. It was definitely better to find a base, whether that's a tent base or a valley base, and do stuff from there. But yeah, I'd be really interested if someone does want to do that. I'd definitely be interested in kind of looking at routes and helping them to figure out a route that would work and stuff.
I wanted to suggest you something about the permission. There was a project. It's called Peaks of the Balkans.
Yeah.
And you can go to the webpage and you can get permission for the 3 countries, like Kosovo, Albania, and Montenegro together. So it was like a mix for the 3 countries. So you apply once and you can get for the 3. We use it during the summer that we do a lot of hikes around all this area.
Fantastic. That's great. Yeah.